Welcome to the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson. Today we set ourselves yet another monumental task. It's a common theme of these podcasts that, having delivered our choices, we all go off and immediately think of another 20 we should have included. And that's where social media comes in useful, as we often continue the debate on Facebook and Twitter. That was certainly the case after the last edition, when we chose our top 5 films about classical music. Many of you choosing titles that we either didn't have time to include, or even better, we hadn't even heard of. And that's one of the great pleasures of this podcast, I think. Discovery, hopefully as much for you as it is for us. So this week's task is this: top 5 pianists. Now, they can be any kind of pianist, not just soloists, orchestral pianists, teachers, session players, accompanists. And with me via Zoom, as always, are the observers Fiona Maddocks and the spectators Richard Bratby. And our special guest is one of our very finest accompanists, Iain Burnside, who's performed with the likes of Joyce D. Donato, Roderick Williams, Benjamin Apple, Sarah Connolly. And he's also a brilliant broadcaster and has written a number of plays, including A Soldier and a Maker, about the poet and composer Ivor Gurney. Iain, such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Great pleasure to be here.
How have you been doing in lockdown? What have you been up to?
Oh, well, I've been keeping busy by fair means or foul. I've been doing quite a lot of piano practice, actually, and plenty of gardening and being nice to my neighbours and all those lockdown things.
Right. And what about actual, work and the piano and all that stuff? I've been talking to a couple of pianists who actually seemingly have decided not to practice at all in the whole lockdown and give themselves some space. So one of the things you could always say about pianists is almost the only thing they ever do is play the piano.
That's right. I think there was a famous American pianist who wrote an autobiography called "I Really Should Be Practicing."
Quite.
we have the little man on our shoulder the whole time, guilt-inducing. So yeah, that has been nice. And I've also been playing things that I think what a lot of us are finding is that it's horrible trying to practice pieces that we should have been playing. And so I think I and a lot of my colleagues have been avoiding that terrain. But I had been deriving great joy from playing things that I don't have to play in concerts shortly. And that's been very therapeutic and warm and cuddly.
So you're preparing for one of these Wigmore Hall concerts, aren't you?
Yes.
And of course, the Radio 3 broadcast started this week with Stephen Huff playing a recital. I just wanted to know whether everyone had heard that, because it got an extraordinary reaction, didn't it? As much for the performance itself as the fact that it existed at all, and that here was a performer playing a concert, albeit in an empty concert hall, but actually in a concert hall at least, rather than in their living room. Iain, did you see it?
I blush to admit I didn't. I'm a huge fan of Stephen's, but I haven't caught up with it as yet.
You must.
So that's part of my homework.
Richard?
Well, my review of it appears on the Arts Desk this morning. A bit of a plug there. So, yes, I heard it. And I had listened to the song recital yesterday as well. And, I mean, it's a funny one, isn't it? I mean, it's a pianist giving a studio recital, essentially, without an audience. In fact, it's just a fact it's in the Wigmore Hall, a beloved venue. It just really, really seems to have touched this chord with everybody. I mean, they could have done it at Maida Vale, they could have done it at wherever, Broadcasting House, where, and any space would have done, really, and it would have just have been as live and as much for a real performance. But I think that fact of putting in the Wigmore really seems to be a stroke of PR genius. It's caught everyone's imagination. It really has tweaked everyone's nostalgia. And I don't know, people reacted very, very, I mean, it's a lovely performance by Stephen. But people really reacted to it, haven't they? People really have. It shows like that first that everyone has to get back into these spaces and how important the venues are, and the sense of community and the sense of shared experience. I mean,
it felt like people needed it, Fiona.
I thought I was going to just sort of quietly have my lunch while I was listening, and I just stood stock still, looking out of the window for the duration. So that says something. Now
then, Iain, I set you this challenge to pick 5 pianists. Did you set yourself a particular criteria? How did you go about it?
Well, it's completely impossible. And I mean, that's a given. I think we all understand that with crystal clarity. I did put in a little request to see if we were allowed to peek at one another's, in the manner of cheating in an exam, if we were allowed to peek over at what everyone else had chosen, so as not to waste any of our 5 choices. But as that's against the school rules,
yes,
as with peeking in any exam, I've kind of rather presumed that we get the Bible and Shakespeare, a la Desert Island Discs. So I haven't gone for necessarily all the greatest pianists. I've kind of presumed that we're all going to agree that Horowitz was a game changer, that Alfred Brendel was a game changer, and Rachmaninoff was a god, and so on and so forth. So I've kind of avoided some of those absolutely pivotal figures, and come up with 5 that I especially love and that touch me in particular ways.
Very good. So let's start with number 1 then.
Okay, number 1 is Marta Augury, who I think has to be on any short list, partly because she debunks any sexist ideas of what women pianists sound like and play and behave, and just because she is a phenomenon loved by pianists and non-pianists alike. She's a tigress at the piano, and she has steel in her fingers and a volcanic temperament, and every concert is an event.
Well, it's the temperament that's the thing, isn't it? Often, no one will doubt her playing and her ability and her technique and all the rest of it. But there's that temperament. There's that thing where you're never quite sure what she's going to do next. Exactly. Maybe even not play the concert, even though she's in the dressing room. That kind of gives it that tension, isn't it? That I guess the audience absolutely loves.
She is a phenomenal collaborator. And those of us in the accompanist trade union really should insist on a veto on people being as good at it as she is. But I think what's interesting is that a lot of pianists get bored mid-career. You can see that there's a considerable distinguished roll call of pianists who go on to become conductors or do different things. And I get the impression that at a certain point, Augury got a bit fed up playing the same concertos, because she doesn't play a huge repertoire. Probably like Horowitz, she plays a massive repertoire at home, but on the stage, she has certain key pieces that she loves. And rather than learn 15 new concertos, she's expanded into the chamber direction, playing violin sonatas with Guido and Kremer amazingly, doing 2 piano stuff. And she is so insightful in the way she does it, and she produces magic. So.
Yeah, Richard, Marta Augury.
I always think of a recording of hers. I think the last time I sat down to actually review anything she did was it was a filmed recording of a concert with the Gustavo Dudamel and his Venezuelan youth orchestra. Her and Barenboim both playing the Mozart double at the keyboards, and Barenboim was very straight ahead, very earnest, serious. That expression he has of sucking a sour plum, And then Martha was next to him, and just this sort of expression of sort of saturnine, I don't know, sort of this little smile just playing on her face, and she just sort of answered his phrases, and she's taking the second part presumably, but absolutely owning it, absolutely. Again, it's that sense of, you have this sense of, this mastery combined with playfulness, combined with that sort of delight in collaboration, and that just sort of knowledge, sort of deep knowledge that sort of does not exclude the possibility of play and of responding to other musicians, which I think, that's what makes her such a great accompanist, presumably, as well. It just came across so vividly in that performance that she sort of, without trying to, stole the show, with all these people taking this important event terribly seriously, and there she was just making music, and in the middle of it, I know exactly what Iain means about the accompanist side of her personality.
I love the playfulness, but I do love that whole danger thing too. I think it does add so much to the experience of seeing her. I remember presenting a prom with her once where we genuinely didn't know whether she was going to come out of the dressing room, and her reputation preceded her, of course. We were all worried about it already before she'd even arrived. And that was when we weren't even sure whether she was going to arrive, and she did arrive. And I'm sure, if I remember, there is also a story in John Drummond's book, Tainted by Experience, where I think they essentially locked her in the dressing room in order to stop her from escaping at some point between rehearsal and concert. I'm pretty sure that's true. But I love that. I think that's exciting. But it does bring that particular quality to the playing where you're almost on the edge of your seat, regardless of what the music is. Fiona, your feelings on Augury?
Yeah, I haven't seen her in concert that many times. There's a sort of shyness about her, which isn't really the normal stance of a virtuoso performer, but that sort of, am I really going to go on this stage and play this piece? Okay, I'm doing it, and I'm doing it my way. And certainly more than once I've heard her conducted by Barenboim, Daniel Barenboim, her great childhood friend, and they've afterwards played a Schubert or Mozart duo. And the sort of protective nature that Barenboim shows towards her in their playing and in their coming off and on the stage. He sort of takes her hand as if she's a small girl, and it's all bound up in the music, of course. I'm describing the extraneous aspects, but it's certainly very touching. But when you hear her play Brahms, she really, magnificent.
Iain, is it a given that a pianist will learn how to play with other musicians rather than just play as themselves when they're actually learning, when they're as a youngster, because it's such a solo instrument when it comes to practice, I suppose. Yeah, that seems obvious, but is there a channel in which one always goes down to learn that side of things as a pianist?
I think that rather depends on the conservatoire you attend, and to a certain extent, the national school within which you find yourself. And I think great pianists have always played chamber music, but there are many who haven't, especially, and there are many musical cultures who don't particularly appreciate it. So it's horses for courses, but I think there's definitely an international trend of all those boundaries being broken down, and the A word, accompanist, can in many cases be scrapped because, well, we've mentioned Stephen Huff already. I mean, he's a classic example. He's such a polymath. If I didn't love him, I'd have to hate him because he's so good at so many things. But playing chamber music, vocal and instrumental, is indeed one of them. He's marvelous at that, and obviously loves doing it. And I think for a lot of the traveling virtuosi, they also see it as something more sociable and an opportunity to explore different forms of music making, different forms of pianism. And look, it's less stressful, it's less hand busting than playing, Brahms E minor concerto. So there's nothing to lose, and there are people to go to the pub with after, So a lot of the younger and middle-aged solo pianists are doing more of it and doing it with great distinction. So I think it's all good.
Did anyone else have Augury in their 5, by the way? Yeah, Fiona? So why didn't we go to you now, Fiona, for one of your other choices?
I had lots of sort of groupings, really. Not groupies, but groupings of pianists I liked, in particular repertoire. Pianists I liked because of their chamber music, the aspect of them. A player who I think has provoked some contrasting views because he's very particular in what he asks of his audiences and could be a bit moody, I suspect. But hear him play Bach and you can forgive an awful lot, and that's Andras Schiff. I've always liked his playing. I love the way he brings Bach to the piano rather than an earlier instrument. And you do feel that he thinks about what he's doing. I don't like everything that he does, but Bach, Schubert, yeah.
Right. Iain?
Yes, he was one of my 5. I do like everything that he does.
I think what I don't like is when he does tell off the audience, which is nothing to do with the music. But I have been quite put out when he's got cross, and I felt quite upset as a member of the audience. But still, I mean, hearing his solo prom playing Bach late night, it was magical, so inventive, witty, humble, towering. Anyway, I interrupted you, Iain, sorry.
No, I agree with all those adjectives. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And he plays a huge repertoire, actually. Of course, there's all his Bach playing, but, he's recorded all the Beethoven sonatas. He plays Janacek, Bartók, all his chamber music. He's a giant. And of course, he's now exploring different pianos. You mentioned earlier instruments. Well, he's also making us reconsider the kind of gray area between the forte pianos, 18th century instruments, and by playing earlier 20th century instruments, and just making us reconsider what piano sound is appropriate to what composer and what the options are, and stopping the hegemony of the Steinway big glossy sound. And that's all part of a great musical exploratory mind. There's the marvelous, and also he's just clever in the best possible way. There's a great story, which I hope isn't apocryphal, that when he was recording the Bach partitas, he did so many in one take that they had a spare session at the end. And while the engineers were rubbing their hands and saying, "Oh well, we can all, we've got Saturday off," kind of thing, he had said, "Well, look, we've got the spare time. What would you like? Why don't I give you the 2 and 3 part inventions?" So we just sat down and played them without expecting to do it. He had them all memorized, and he did them, and they put them out. And this level of musical intellect, I mean, it's not everything, but when it's allied to this extraordinary connection with the keyboard, then you're cooking with gas.
Does that mean then, therefore, Richard, that someone like that can get away with telling the audience off in the way that he sometimes does, because we have to put it down to genius?
He seems to, doesn't he? I mean, it certainly stopped me ever going back to his concerts when given the choice. On the other hand, his recording of the Janáček, Overgrown Path and Piano Sonata is one of the treasures of my collection. And it's interesting, maybe the man is not fitted to the concert hall. On the other hand, as Fiona says, in the right circumstances, he can create this magic, really. I do have a big problem with the sort of the bossiness. He feels he's not getting the audience he deserves. I mean, I wouldn't say a dogmatic point, but sort of general point of principle. I am on the side of the audience. I feel the musician and the music is there to serve the audience, not the other way around. And the last time I saw him, it was Schubert Sonatas at Symphony Hall, Birmingham, and we got told off before he played a note, and you felt the mood sour. You felt the connection go down there.
And how were you told off? What happened?
I think people didn't settle down quickly enough. This was a few years ago now, probably about a decade. And people were not settling down. I think possibly some people were being admitted to the hall just as he was coming in, which is regrettable, of course, and generally to be avoided. But a lot of pianists would have dealt with it. It's just a fact of life, and one would hope. It certainly didn't justify telling, sort of creating that mood in the hall. And as you say, you take the music out from that in detachment. It's such a wonderful thing. And, the intelligence, sensitivity of the playing, the refinement, that sort of, I love anyone who's interested in Janáček and Bartók. It's very hard for me not to respond to that aesthetic and to do it with such intelligence and sensitivity. There are still people out there who regard some of this repertoire as being marginal. Incredibly, even today, I think one encounters him, and a player of that authority and seriousness giving it his full attention really says a lot.
I was just thinking of the exact opposite of what happened with you with Schiff telling everyone off before it started. Was a concert years and years ago, quite a well-known pianist that I was presenting a live concert for. On he came, sat down, created this extraordinary kind of atmosphere of anticipation, and then the page turner sort of leant in a little bit, and we didn't know what they'd said. And what in fact the page turner had said is, "You've forgotten your music." And so he went off, came back on with the music, but of course the audience was absolutely in the palm of his hand from that moment on, because they all loved him for it, because it's such a silly mistake. I love that. Why have a page turner when you don't have any music, Ian?
Can I just add a piano geek thing to go back to Schiff's actual playing? I think he has the best trill in the business. He is when you listen to him, particularly in Bach, obviously you get it most there, because he doesn't trill too fast. And if you're being a trill policeman, listen to how people come out of trills into the non-trill substance, because he does that with such elegance and such micro control. And you only notice it if you're listening out for it, but it's just something once it grabs your attention. He's just oozing class. It's also interesting in that Fiona was talking about listening to groupings of pianists, and I think what's interesting is that he doesn't fit into any neat school of playing. His Hungarian background, he's a very different animal to Kocsis and Ranki, who were his kind of Hungarian contemporaries who are much more overtly virtuoso and play a different repertoire. And, when he's been asked about his influences, he mentions George Malcolm. He's just got a very particular, very individual pedigree and kind of provenance. And I find that very interesting, the way that comes through in his playing of different repertoires. So you can't just plop him neatly into particular national schools, and that's always interesting.
Interesting to see how many of our choices have very wide repertoires, because a lot of pianists don't have wide repertoires, or at least we like hearing them in a particular part of the repertoire. That's true, isn't it? But Richard, a choice from you.
I was going to go straight in there at the top with Rachmaninoff. I think Iain has rather covered that one already. He said it's like the Bible and Shakespeare, isn't it? You can't it's a sort of a given. It just does interestingly tie into what you just said about particular repertoire. Obviously, throughout his career, he got more and more pigeonholed playing his own stuff. But his own repertoire beyond that was not vast. I think it's Barry Martin's biography of lists his concert repertoire, and a lot of things fell out of it by the 1910s, really. And so later life, he had sort of a handful of short recital pieces, including many of his own famous transcriptions, a lot of Chopin, a lot of the things we would expect to find in a modern pianist's sort of, on their stock shelf, the Bach, the Beethoven and so on, was not really there with Rachmaninoff. And yet, what can one, I don't know, it's tricky because we can summon up these legendary figures from the past. We can talk about Liszt, we'll never know how he played. Rachmaninoff is the closest to that is almost within living memory. I'm sure we've all met or spoken to people who heard or experienced Rachmaninoff play. I knew an elderly gentleman when I was a child on Merseyside who heard him play the Liverpool Philharmonic in what must have been 1938. He'd actually been playing in the orchestra on that occasion. And he just told me how Rachmaninoff came and sat in the second half of the concert when he was also sitting out because they're playing something, I think Mozart or something, and sat there on the chair next to him, this huge, silent man with these spreading his hands out across the arms of the chair in the Philharmonic Hall, and you put on these old recordings, the Ormandy, the Philadelphia recordings, and the older ones, even the piano rolls, if you're inclined to trust those things, and you're aware that you're sort of connecting. It's a sort of hotline back into the great age of classical music, a world that you wouldn't believe we could touch anymore. And there he is, this sort of player of enormous clarity and surprisingly, sort of enormous restraints as well as the virtuosity which is there. I think it's the restraint that astonishes me most. When you hear him playing his own concertos on recording, you don't hear the sort of spectacular, Earl Wild style, Horowitz style sort of flamboyance, brilliance, kind of. You hear the control and the command. He's never racing it. He's never rushing it. You hear him bringing out the lines, the inner parts that you wouldn't have thought mattered. It's never a wallow. It's always with clarity, always with seriousness. And I think there's a sense you get about it, this enormous gravity. This is a great man, a great moment in time, which is still within touching distance. And I mean, that's something I can't really think about or listen to without sort of getting the shivers, really.
This is what I find fascinating about listening to those recordings of his, is you do well probably overall to avoid a composer's own version of when they're conducting an orchestra of their own piece. So I don't know, I suppose Stravinsky is a good example of how he would record his own pieces more than once and they'd be completely different each time. So where on earth do you go when you want to interpret it yourself with that? But I wonder with Rachmaninoff, Iain, whether that really is because he's performing his own work on an instrument as opposed to conducting it, whether that actually means a lot more to us in the subsequent interpretation of a piece if you're approaching it yourself.
Yeah, I think if you're treading in those very large footsteps, you have to find your own way of doing it. But I completely agree with Richard. The interesting thing is he's sort of misunderstood as a composer because people think of him as this hyper-romantic, very lush figure. And of course, there's a lushness to music and it's the end of the romantic tradition. But he is absolutely not indulgent. And the austerity, I would even say, of some of his performing choices is what stands out. And as Richard says, the inner lines, it's all about counterpoint. He's very much in the Chopin tradition in that, because everyone thinks of Chopin as a great melodist, but in fact, it's really about the interplay between the hands and what's going in. And Rachmaninoff is his heir in that regard via Tchaikovsky. And, you listen to how the opening of the third concerto when Rachmaninoff plays it, it's very fast, very austere, plain song. It's never about heart on sleeve. There's always this classical restraint, and I totally agree with every word Richard said there about connecting with the kind of golden age. You're also connecting with Imperial Russia, the values of Tsarist Russia. It's taking its you know, it's before the cherry orchard was cut down, and you're connecting with all of that, and it's very, very interesting. And also in terms of his repertoire, well, you're right. It wasn't huge at the end, but because of course there's a supply and demand going on, and I suppose he was always asked when he at a certain level of fame. I mean, there are so few composers within the last century who have achieved such eminence in both spheres. And let's not forget that also in his early days, he spent several years conducting opera. He had an actual opera conducting job and conducted an amazing number of serious operas. I mean, this is a huge musical brain. And the fact that he could play with such incredible distinction at the end of his life is, you know, it's just something so out of the ordinary.
Fiona?
Well, I can't add to all those things. So I had written down Rachmaninoff sort of before I wrote down Andras Schiff or Marta Augury, both of whom we've already discussed. But I did, as one of my categories, I'm sure you did too, have composer pianists, and those contemporaries of Rachmaninoff like Prokofiev, Bartók, and then Shostakovich, and then Britten. And in our own time, Thomas Addis and composers like Hugh Watkins and Ryan Wigglesworth. I think they are really always worth hearing. And I just think they won't necessarily come up in our top 5, but they need a mention.
Well, Tom Addis was definitely going to come up for me because he is really an outstanding pianist. I don't think there's any question about that. I remember seeing him play those Nankoro player piano pieces, which are virtually impossible when he played them like they were, you know, whatever. It was amazing virtuosity. And indeed his own pieces, which are incredibly difficult to play. I just love watching him. He's a fantastic presence at the piano.
And also his playing of Janacek. Fantastic.
Yes. One of the ones I wanted to bring in, I mentioned about pianists with very wide repertoires, but I wanted to bring in someone who is associated almost entirely around one composer, and actually I rather love it, which is Georges Cifra, who was best known for playing Liszt, shared a heritage with Liszt. But what I love about Cifra, there's a wonderful film. There's lots of films of him playing. Of course, became very celebrated, and he lived in Paris in the later part of his life, and he was always being asked to play Liszt. And there's a nice interview where he says, I'm always being asked to play Liszt, but he doesn't mind it. He clearly doesn't mind it. But there's the great showpiece, the Grand Galop Chromatique, which I first came across his playing on a it was actually a program, I think it was a DVD called Greatest Pianist or something like that, and it was just him playing this piece, and I thought it was spectacular. I'd never come across the piece before, and I immediately went on YouTube to watch lots of other people perform it, all of whom played it much slower, but perhaps with a little bit more accuracy. But Cifra seemed to embody the music in a way with Liszt I think that very few people have ever managed since. It's spontaneous. It seems like he's composing it as he's playing it. I think there's a lot to do with, I mean, when I discovered that he used to play jazz in cafes and things like that, makes perfect sense. He's that kind of, I don't know, gypsy pianist, if you like, the roving pianist who just go around and play anything off the top of his head. And he manages to make Liszt sound like that, which I'm pretty sure is how Liszt would have intended it and would have played it himself, of course. So it does feel like this kind of channel from Liszt through to Cifra, and I just find it so exciting. It's a wonderful little moment at the end of his performance of the Chromatique, where the camera, he finishes, and the camera goes up to his face, and he stays very still until the very last moment. You see a little smile curl up on his lip, where he's thinking, that was pretty good, wasn't it? And I love that. There's a little arrogance about it. Fabulous. Ian, have you know about Cifra?
Yeah, a bit. I haven't listened to a huge amount, but as you were saying that, I thought you were about to cue up a story, and I think I've got this right. Isn't there also a marvelous YouTube clip of him doing a balance test before some recording or warming up, where he's practicing whatever it is and for the mics and everything, and then he goes off on one, and it sort of takes different turns, and then he jumps up from the piano and lights a cigarette or something. I think I might be.
It sounds like him.
But I think it's right, and it's just staggering piano playing, and you know, because he's off, it's a bit slightly sneaky thing to do, to put these things out, but it is also magical because he's off duty and letting his hair down and all those things. But yeah, he could do anything, I think.
I mean, because I was also going to mention Marc-Andre and Milan in the sense that of this extraordinary technical ability that he manages to make look so easy, as if he could just sit down and play whatever it is that's in front of him. But it's not a self-conscious way of doing it. It just seems so spontaneous, so exciting, therefore. Iain, let's have another one.
Well, if we want to carry on this conversation about links with particular composers, I would like to put on the table Vladimir Sofronitsky, who is slightly niche. Am I looking at blank faces there? So Sofronitsky features prominently if you're interested in the music of Scriabin, in that he married Scriabin's daughter. That's not really the punchline of the story, though. He was an amazing pianist, kind of between the Rachmaninoff and the Richter generations, a slightly older generation than Richter and Gilels. And he did not play, he hardly played at all outside the Soviet Union. I think he played in France once, something like that. And the recorded legacy we have is largely, but not exclusively, Scriabin. And he also was a marvelous Chopin player. There's a beautiful Schumann Carnival, and he was a very important musical personality in Moscow in that Soviet era. But it is extraordinary playing, and he so embodies the whole Scriabin aesthetic from early to late. He's so inside the language that it just sounds like someone speaking very naturally, and I absolutely love his playing. There's some, I mean, you can find more bravura, you can find more this, more that in other people, but there's something so personal that I just buy it. I think he's wonderful. Is he someone who's playing you guys are familiar with at all?
Only as a name.
Well, this is a first, but it's a rather splendid one. I love it when someone comes up with something no one else has come across. That's brilliant. Well, I wanted to ask you, though, Iain, when we did this program on violinists, one of the things that came up was the change in style over the years, depending on what decade perhaps we were talking about. I mean, with violin playing, it's the obvious one with the portamento, the sliding sort of style that was nearer the first half of the 20th century. Is there any difference in style really in piano playing in the recordings that we hear of these pianists over a century?
Oh, sure. Well, the most obvious one is hands together or not. I mean, because at a certain point, it was the absolute norm to do kerrang. Pianists wouldn't have dreamt of playing a bass note and a melodic treble note together. You automatically play the bass note like a grace note. And now if you do that, you're either derided for being massively tasteless or supremely tasteful and historically aware. I mean, he pays your money and takes your choice. But I mean, that's the, if you listen to Paderewski, he does kerrang, 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 kerrang every phrase. And I find it a bit wearying just because I'm not used to it. But what's interesting about that is, you know, Schumann, for example, notates a lot of that. He does write grace note kind of connections. The interesting thing is, when did composers stop writing that down, or what did it mean when they did write it down? But anyway, let's not go down that rabbit hole. And the simple answer is yes, there are lots of periody things that people did, I think.
Richard?
It's a name that is new to me, I have to say. I put my cards on my table. I sort of got through a basic rudimentary musical education without acquiring any keyboard skills. So the piano repertoire has always been something of a sort of something I approach as an outsider. But I am fascinated by this idea of sort of horses for courses, the Scriabin specialists. Scriabin in particular just seems to be one of these composers who you either get him, really get him, or you don't as a performer. And I was fascinated, we mentioning Rachmaninoff earlier. There's a documented account, I think Prokofiev publicly disagreed with Rachmaninoff about his performance of Scriabin. I think soon after Scriabin's death, Rachmaninoff played one of the sonatas, and he was grudgingly complimentary. But he said afterwards that when Scriabin played the music seemed to take wing. It seemed to have have a sort of elevation to it, a sort of a bit quality of taking flight, which apparently Rachmaninoff, for all his phenomenal qualities, never quite got inside. But it's fascinating how some pianists really get it. I mean, a colleague of mine, I've often worked with, Peter Donahoe, is one of these pianists who sort of eats notes for breakfast. He just shuffles them down. He just the more black stuff there is on a page, the more he likes it. And I've seen him sort of come into a recital. He'll sort of look at a short piece, an encore, for 5 minutes before going on with it and playing it for the first time with this stupendous force and panache. But Scriabin, again, is something he seems to be very, very inside. It's a particular kind of mindset. And again, it's hard to imagine, say, Andras Schiff playing it, though it would be fascinating, wouldn't it, to hear it? Just as perhaps you wouldn't necessarily want to hear. Well, I wonder what Scriabin playing Bach would have been like. We'll speculate about that. But
it's a very particular aesthetic. It's a perfumed garden.
So I was listening just before we came on to Scriabin's Piano Concerto, which is a work I absolutely adore. I mean, really, really unaccountably neglected, I think. As you say, Perfume Garden of a piece, lush, late romantic, being played by Solomon.
Oh, yeah.
Or Solomon Kuttner, to give him his full name, who's sort of another one of these pianists who seemed to almost have a kind of cult status in the middle of the 20th century, and then I think his career was cut short rather cruelly in the 1950s, I think, by ill health, but had this remarkable sort of status and this sort of ability to sort of, I don't know, something about making this music glow in a strange, I know there's an enormous virtuosity there. His recording of the Bliss Concerto is just a volcano, it's hell of a thing. With bolt conducting, but again, there's clearly a certain kind of psychology, a certain kind of musical personality that can relate to this repertoire. And I do find that interesting, and of course, if your destiny is to play Liszt phenomenally well, are you going to be taken as seriously as the person who is turning out earnest, serious, beautifully considered sets of Bach French suites, or will you be sidelined because the repertoire is not deemed as important?
That's something that will come up, I think, a little bit later on. Fiona, can we have another choice from you?
I've got so many as ever that I was slightly waiting to see which direction Iain's choices went. I was looking at some of the younger pianists currently making a mark, and I think the ones that I'm always interested in are the ones that, rather like Andras Schiff, have a big imaginative approach to repertoire and a sort of daring. And I do think one of the interesting ones at the moment is Igor Levit, and the repertoire he's chosen, often epic works, seriously epic work lasting hours and hours, but bold, and really he grasps them with all his brain and his heart. And it seems to me formidably good playing, but over to Iain on that.
Oh, phenomenal. He's a sensational pianist. I love his playing, and his Beethoven in particular. But yeah, I echo all of that. And the way he plays these Frederick Rzewski, the People United variations, incredible. No, he just eats it all for breakfast. He's really a major figure, I think. Also, he's interesting and he's very politically committed, and he's got this big online presence. He's truly a child of our time. But the main focus is just this really, really extraordinary Beethoven playing, which is gimmick-free, it seems to me, from what I've heard. I mean, I first heard him when he was a new generation artist on Radio 3, and I without knowing it was him, came in the end of a Wigmore, and it was one of the late Beethoven sonatas. It was just completely spellbinding. I think he's a marvellous pianist. Yeah. Big takes all round.
I think it's unlikely, isn't it, that we will produce young pianists who don't have a wide repertoire. I mean, they're not likely, presumably now, to have a concentrated repertoire of just the classics, and the Bachs and the Beethovens and the Schumanns and so on and so forth. That they are going to have an interest in the music of now, as much as in the last 50 years or so. Would you agree with that, Iain? It's much more likely now that we're going to have those broader musicians, if you like.
It is more likely now, but again, it does depend on the sort of national schools. We haven't talked yet about the fact that Asian pianists are having an enormous effect on the musical landscape And I've been in some piano juries and everything where you could have had a final of only Korean pianists or Chinese. Yes. I mean, both of those countries are producing staggering numbers of phenomenal pianists. But they're not particularly noted for all their many virtues. And I'm not trying to damn with faint praise here at all, because I'm a huge fan of both of those national pianistic cultures. But they do tend to stick to absolutely central competition-y type classics and the canon of great works. And those cultures are not particularly setting out to inspire musical explorers. That might come later, and in some cases does. But within the more traditional, and you can say the same a bit about Russian pianists, actually. I mean, you look at someone like Trifonov, who is just simply phenomenal pianist and, historically good, but he does pretty much stick to, this transcendental etudes, Rachmaninoff, and which he does magnificently. But, he may be learning the Ligeti etudes, I don't know, but I haven't heard word of that. Or the Addis concerto,
Well, two of the pianists I wanted to bring in, who I sort of grouped together, but most definitely unfairly, but two pianists who I think just do so much repertoire that many other pianists don't touch. One in particular is Nicholas Hodges, who seems to me puts an awful lot of effort into playing the pieces that no one else would touch. And the other one is Joanna McGregor. Just on Nicholas Hodges, for me, so many of the works that he performs, they are those pieces, they are in the corners of those repertoire that very rarely get much of an outing in sort of what you might call mainstream concerts. And that's what I think makes it so exciting. I remember seeing him, I was making a program for Radio 4 on Darmstadt. It was about how the CIA allegedly funded Darmstadt for the first few years of its life in the late 40s. And Christopher Fox, the composer, and I were working on this. And Chris is an old hand of Darmstadt, which for people who haven't been is quite an experience for contemporary music nuts. And we were sitting there in a concert, and a lot of the pieces have been fairly humdrum. I have to say, it wasn't that interesting. And then Nick Hodges came on and played this piece. It was so outrageous, so impenetrable, so difficult to listen to and clearly to play. And oh man, it was like slipping into a nice warm bath. This is what it's about. And he plays it with such extraordinary skill, of course, but real passion for this music. I felt these are the pianists we need for this music. You can't just play that music. You have to really believe it. Otherwise, it is just a piece of music. I mean, of course, that's the same with all music. But I think as far as an advocate for pure, often very difficult contemporary concert music, Nicholas Hodges is very important in this. Fiona, you wanted to chip in?
I had both Nicholas Hodges and Joanna McGregor on my list as players who have really taken a responsibility for what's going on here and now. And who knows where a lot of that music will go, we can't possibly say, but to show that commitment with such big spirit and brilliance is, I had to have them there.
Well, and the other great thing I think about Joanna McGregor, apart from her playing and her versatility, of course, is she just does have this wonderful connection with the audience. I think she has an ability to connect with people and a wider audience. And I think seeing her play Triangulina Symphony, for example, very exciting. I mean, she's got the hair thing, going, that's all very exciting to watch. But she does, I think, have the common touch. I suppose that's one of the ways of putting it. Sounds wrong somehow, but
she has expanded the audience. It's not the only thing you want of a musician. It's not the only job they have to do, but she stands out for that.
Well, and Iain was talking about collaborations in chamber music. I think Joanna McGregor's collaborations with world musicians, with jazz musicians, and many, many other types of musicians, I think, really, really do mark her out. Iain, on the two I've mentioned, Nick Hodges.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Joanna's amazing in that she is just broad. She's pulled the camera lens back and expanded the scope of classical concerts, and that's hugely admirable. And as for Nick Hodges, my God, the things I have to lie down just thinking of the pieces he takes on. I mean, he just, to me, he's less of a performer, more a kind of Arctic explorer. I mean, he's setting off with his poles across the frozen terrain into areas that have been unmapped. You know, it's just without his capacity. You know, he's there in his own. I mean, chapeau, really, just incredible.
It's the pieces when you look at the score, and I think to myself, I couldn't play one hand with two hands, exactly. Let alone two. Yeah, well, you know what I mean. It's incredible, and it so often sounds like four hands, in fact, doesn't it? And a lot of these pieces are written on, because obviously the standard piano piece written on two staves. A lot of these are much expanded, aren't they? Just looking at them is the scores is absolutely frightening. Iain, tell me that you've got an accompanist on your list, please.
No, I haven't. Well, I've got Marta Augury and I've got Andras Schiff. Come on.
Well, okay, fair enough.
No, because I think I'm more interested in integrating that into the rest of the musical fabric than setting it up as in its own niche. I think it's become its own niche too much, maybe. So no, I'm afraid I'm not going along with you there. However, can I put my next name on the table? Art Tatum.
Right.
Horowitz famously said of Art Tatum, he plays as many notes as I do. The only difference is he's making them up at the same time.
Very good.
And this is just unbelievable virtuosity. And he has a quality that not many of the pianists we've mentioned so far has, which is cheekiness. It's so throwaway and insouciant is perhaps the word, that he just, you talk about the little grin on Cifra's face. Well, there's a grin in Art Tatum's face, metaphorically speaking, the whole time. And if we're again going a bit geeky, what the French call je perlais, the finger articulation of a certain slightly detached sort, without even knowing it was called je perlais, probably. Art Tatum does this so instinctively, and as he rips up the keyboard, and you get this incredible articulation within fast passage work. It is like Horowitz.
Well, I'm going to allow you that one, Iain, although it is slightly cheating because of it being a jazz player, I think. But because otherwise I would.
You said it was all up for grabs.
Well, because otherwise I'd have put Oscar Peterson in, who I think was
exactly.
And could basically do anything. And in fact, I urge people to go on to YouTube.
You can't say there are no school rules and then put a school rule.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
If we're talking about wit, I think we could go back to where we started with Stephen Huff. Is a very witty player. I mean, he brings all the other stuff too.
And Schiff.
Yes, and Schiff. But another player that we haven't mentioned, who is probably a very particular kind of player, and I think very brilliant in Prokofiev, but not necessarily lots of other repertoire, and that's Yuja Wang. But when you hear her encore, she is hilarious. She's digitally pretty mercurial, but she's very witty.
Well, I've just had two of my choices sort of picked from under me there. We've got Stephen Huff and Yuja Wang, and because of that quality, the mentions of the wittiness, the playfulness. These Stephen Huff has always this kind of wears a very remarkable intelligence at work there. Nothing is ever done lightly with Stephen Huff, but yes, on the other hand, he does make it playful. He makes it spontaneous. He makes it fresh, and he's not snobbish about repertoire. I'm not sure jazz will be his thing, but he certainly light music, all sorts of stuff. You imagine it when he's playing Billy Mayle, playing what's his name, Percy Grange transcriptions, lollipops of all sorts, all the sort of forgotten silent pieces of the turn of the century. He does this. He makes every one of them sound like you're having the most exquisite musical experience, the most delightful, sort of sense-satisfying, sort of fancy-tickling sort of musical experience. The lightness, the transparency, the wit, and the naturalness of it. And that's also, Yuja Wang, we just mentioned. It's the encores, isn't it? As we said, I've heard her do the Prokofiev Third Concerto astonishingly live. Heard her do John Adams's new concerto. It's called "The Devil Has All the Best Tunes." Not such a great piece, and one that didn't really play to her strengths, I thought. but then you know you're going to get these encores, and this is the moment. This is the moment when you feel what Liszt's audience must have felt, what Rachmaninoff's audience must have felt. You're going to be dazzled. You're going to be enchanted. You're going to be swept away. She makes sounds that you wouldn't think it was possible to get out of a piano. She does things you wouldn't think human fingers could achieve. And I remember the last time I was at Edinburgh last summer. I think it was after the Addis piece. She did about 4 encores. I just remember walking out into the foyer at the Usher Hall, just grinning from ear to ear. This was absolute musical delight. This is it. This is the essence of what one wants from a live performance, I thought. And what a technique, what a charisma, what a way of connection with the audience, and just the way the pianist used to sort of melt into this sort of. She conjures the music as if the instrument is almost not there. You hear
so
sounds.
many of those qualities you just talked about are also ones that people talk about with Lang Lang, aren't they? Mm-hmm. The flamboyance and the phenomenal technique and everything.
Well,
but it's never done anything for me.
There's flamboyance and there's flamboyance. I mean, there's this, there's sort of barnstorming. We all know what that means. Anyone can sort of bring a house down by sort of crashing away at great speed and at great volume. It's the astonishing sort of subtlety of what Wang does within the course of doing something that seems flippant, that seems throwaway. The fact that the way she makes a sort of phrase, her tone seems to melt halfway through a note. She seems to be able to have that ability to change the tone of what she's playing mid-note, which I don't think is physically possible on a piano. It's this fantastic illusion. It's sort of, I don't know, it's all the sort of sensual layers, all the sensual centres are being tickled simultaneously when she plays. The softness, the brilliance, the panache, the poetry, the quiet refinement, all just sort of flicker by, and it's just, I mean, I just get excited thinking about it. This is kind of what this is what I want from a piano. What I want from a piano soloist, and I think denying that she is a phenomenon is just impossible. I think she's there, and every time I think, God, I'm lucky to have heard that.
Iain, you mentioned about the Bible and Shakespeare. We have to talk about Horowitz. Which one is he? Is he Bible or Shakespeare?
Oh, what a question. Yes. I don't know the answer to that question.
There is no answer to that question. Let's talk about Horowitz.
Well, it's interesting that, I mean, sitting listening to Fiona and Richard there, the Dour Presbyterian in me was slightly bridling at both of them saying, it's all about the encores.
No, I would never say anything was all about the encores.
Well, I
would
did.
say Richard might have done. But I would say that in her case, she brings something which is. I mean, I'm quite keen to leave before encores because usually I've had enough. But she brings something different. That's all I was saying. But Richard went rather further.
Richard did go rather further. I'm building up ahead.
And why not?
If I may be so bold, but look, both Lang Lang and Yuja Wang have such phenomenal pianistic possibilities. There's no question of that. But the interesting thing, going back to what Tommy asked, is that for a lot of people, Horowitz was about the encores too, and in a sense, cultivated that. It was part of the branding. And Lang Lang and Yuja are, in their own ways, kind of grandchildren of Horowitz in that regard. In the just that amazing digital display was part of the whole thing. But yes, Horowitz has many children and grandchildren, and he just redefined what was possible, really. And he's also interesting. We've talked a lot about repertoire and who plays what. He's the classic example of someone who played so much more at home than he showed on stage. He had a famously vast repertoire of things that he played, with a lot of contemporary music and a lot of off the beaten track stuff. But he was very clever and very specific at channeling what he actually committed to on stage. And also, it was interesting in that he had these different phases of his career and had a sort of breakdown in the middle for various personal reasons, and did the comeback thing when the stakes were already so astronomically high. It's a very, very interesting story. There
are so many other, I mean, this guy's hundreds of names we could mention, aren't there? I mean, a couple of others that came up when I did my usual thing, which I put on Facebook. I wanted to know what people other people's ideas about it. Something actually, the oboist Nicholas Daniel mentioned that his three favourites were Pariah, Augury, and Haskell, all of which are and Lipati as well. He said it was interesting that there are three Romanians in that list, but also, of course, Alfred Brendel comes up. I think he got a very brief mention earlier on, but Brendel comes up, and I think he's not in my top 5, but he's certainly someone I think that needs to be mentioned. And a couple of things I really love about listening to him play, and actually there's a quote of his, I wrote it down, which I think sort of says it, where he said he comes from a tradition that makes the masterpiece tell the performer what he should do, and not the performer telling the piece what it should be like, which I think sort of encapsulates Brendel perhaps perfectly. And I also love the fact he was always at other people's concerts, very usually 20th century music or new music concerts, always interested in new music, even though it wasn't much part of his own repertoire, which I rather like, because so often musicians don't do that. They don't go to each other's concerts. They don't sit down and listen to other people's performances. And I get that too, but it was always nice to see him. I remember hearing a plastic bag being rattled just before a piece was being played at the Cheltenham Town Hall once. And I looked round and it was Brendel arriving late. And he's the only person with a loud plastic bag I've ever known where nobody said anything. Because normally there's a lot of tutting and finger wagging at that, but everyone went, "Oh, it's Brendel," and therefore he mustn't say anything. But no, I think he. And did anyone else have Brendel on their list, or at least near to their list, Richard?
I sort of mulled it over. It's terrible, really. I only heard him perform live once in Birmingham, and I fell asleep during the course of that. It had been a long day, and it fell into that sweet spot between 7:30 and 8 p.m. where Morpheus draws his veil over one's eyes, and that was that. I slept through my one chance to hear Brendel, which I've been but I did encounter him a couple of seasons ago at the Untitled Camden Festival. Paul Lewis had been playing Beethoven concerto, and I just heard this sort of voice mumbling behind me, remarkable, extraordinary. And I thought, that's nice that someone's appreciating it. And I sort of looked around afterwards, and it was Brendel. And that says something. He slipped in at the back and was just absolutely captivated by another much younger, very different artist. I mean, I know Paul had studied with Brendel and sort of looked up to him, and nonetheless, that generosity of spirit and that interest was very striking.
Fiona? Is someone I've seen Brendel at many concerts, and I suppose it's just that because he's no longer playing, he hasn't featured as prominently as he might have done had we been doing this while his career was still active. And I think that's also probably true of Mitsuko Uchida, who we haven't mentioned, but who has played such an enormous role in musical life and also plays with wit and in a range of repertoire. And we think of her as playing the major works of Beethoven and Schubert and so on, but she also plays Schoenberg and Birtwistle, and she's been an adventurous and dedicated player of real singularity, and I think a lot of people would want her on a list.
Yeah. Iain?
Yeah, just to go back to Brendel briefly, I think he's been so important that he's easy to underestimate historically. I mean, the interesting thing is that he also overlapped in terms of timescale with a lot of the early music movement, and in many ways anticipated many of the revelations, including the rehabilitation of Haydn, because Brendel was one of the first pianists that I heard who didn't just play Haydn as the first piece, the warmer-upper, or he played several Haydn sonatas, and he played them with such authority. And again, we come back to the wit thing. He was very important with all of that. But, Diabelli Variations and other huge pieces that were just so compelling. And unlike Richard, I did not fall asleep when I heard him live. I heard him several times live. And as a teenager, you mentioned Cheltenham, Tommy. As a teenager, a callow youth, I heard him play at the Cheltenham Festival. I was in Cheltenham for a few days, and I heard him play Beethoven 1 and 2 in the same concert. And it was absolutely electrifying. It was completely compelling. And again, one of the interesting things is that it was 1 and 2, not 4 and 5 or 3. And he also gave some classes to the young Imogen Cooper and others, rather terrifying masterclasses where he made the students do things like, they were very good pianists, it was a very high level, and he wasn't horrible to them or anything, but he just showed his level of study was just so extraordinary. He was familiar with the manuscripts and first editions of these pieces and would ask questions that would presume knowledge of that. Scary. And he also did this terrifying thing where one pianist was playing, Beethoven or Schubert sonata, from memory, of course, and he said, do it again, and this time call out the dynamics as they occur. So they had to play and say, piano, mezzo forte, crescendo. And of course, he got it completely wrong. And Rendell stopped them, and everyone laughed, and Rendell stopped them and said, well, you've memorized all the notes. Why are the dynamics any less important? Why is this a less significant layer of the text? And at which point you think, yeah, we're not in Kansas anymore. This is serious stuff here. So that was again, it's a level of intellectual inquiry and rigor that is just, game changing.
Mention of Cheltenham reminds me of two other performances that really knocked me sideways. I was there because I was presenting them, but my goodness, they therefore were real surprises to me. One was Shura Cherkassky, and actually it turned out it was his last ever broadcast. This was in 1995 at Cheltenham. And I think, again, the thing about that was the atmosphere that he created in that hall, everyone right on the edge of their seat throughout the whole thing. And then this incredible playing. Wow. I mean, again, he had everyone in the palm of his hand. And you know what? I can't even remember what it was he played. I could just remember being completely captivated by the whole experience. And Cherkassky off stage could be a real experience too. And the other one was...
Did he chase you around the dressing room?
He didn't chase me around the dressing room, no. But I know there was a demand for a kiss at some point from one of the members of staff at the BBC. That's for another podcast, I think. The other one was Piotr Andrzejewski at the same Cheltenham Festival, actually, in the Pitville Pump Room, playing Bach, which was absolutely fabulous. Again, really captivating. I'd not come across him before. I think he's quite young then anyway. This was 95, so it's quite some time ago now. But for me, the really extraordinary thing about that was it was a live lunchtime concert on Radio 3, and 5 minutes before we were going on, he'd locked himself out of his dressing room before he'd put his trousers on. So he was standing in the corridor in his boxer shorts. So because it was a live broadcast, I got my script, I tried to sort something out for him, and in running downstairs, ran into a pillar, which knocked me out pretty much. So when the producer, Jeremy Hayes, walked in, he had his presenter lying on the floor, holding his head with blood coming out, and his soloist standing there in his boxer shorts, locked out of his dressing room. It's just one of those everyday occurrences.
Please tell me there was a happy ending to that story, Tommy.
And there is a very happy ending, because we got ourselves together. Someone found a key for his dressing room, and he came on. I mean, it was literally like with 30 seconds to spare. I'd had to go on anyway. I did my bit, and he came on. And then, I mean, maybe it's because of that happened that I remember it so vividly, but it was an extraordinary performance, and it really, again, held everybody captivated. I remember thinking then, this is someone most definitely to watch. Ian, you were gesticulating then.
No, I was just trying to think of circumstances in which I would leave a dressing room in my boxer shorts. But
exactly right.
You say, maybe that's for another occasion.
No, it was the good old days of the show. Where are we? Now, we've had a lot of crossing over or common choices here. Ian, have you done all yours?
No, I've got one left.
Right, go for it.
Gregory Sokolov. Have any of you had the experience?
Only on disc.
On disc,
so, yeah, I've only had it on disc too. So he's a very Marmite figure and rather controversial in that he's been a little under the radar. He won the Tchaikovsky competition when he was 16. Russian-based, but has travelled quite a lot, and now has a kind of Indian summer career as a guru in his later years and a cult figure. And I've come quite late to the party, and I came rather skeptically because I don't react generally well towards the guru myth-making thing. And some of what he plays is unbearable, I think. So there's some very dour Bach that you want to run a mile from. But when he's on, oh my God, he is just absolutely staggering. And he's very interesting in that he plays both titanically huge pieces and exquisite miniatures. So if it's all about the encores, chaps, check his out, because they're pretty good. He does lots of Ramon Couperin with amazing ornaments and things. But he also, on YouTube, there's a titanic Brahms B-flat concerto. He plays the hammer clavier. Huge pieces are his thing, and he plays everything as if his life depends on it. It is just extraordinary. And there's a marvelous Chopin Preludes from the Salzburg Festival, live at the Salzburg Festival, and you just feel a lifetime's study, a lifetime's thinking about music compressed into these miniatures, and I find him completely riveting.
Well, I think I like the idea that, as you said, you don't have to be a specialist at everything. And some of the most fascinating musical figures get some areas of the repertoire so horribly wide of the mark, or shockingly wrong, one might think, and yet other things so compellingly right. I mean, I had Glenn Gould on my list, a mind there that goes far, far, far beyond music. And a sound that is instantly recognisable whether you like it or not. Someone I talk to a great deal about Bach in particular is Mahan Esfahani. I know he feels very strongly that Glenn Gould represents pretty much everything that's wrong about Bach playing, and furthermore, that his celebrity has done immense damage to the way that people play and perceive Bach. Yet, at the same time, I can see absolutely where he's coming from. But if I see his name on a disc, I think that is going to be interesting. That is going to be worth hearing from. I did just want to come back briefly on Yuzhou Wang. I'm not obsessed or anything, but to say that she is, interestingly, she's now doing more and more chamber music. She's touring. She's holding a trio with the Otten Summers. Certainly with one of the Otten Summers clarinetists, and is touring as a clarinet trio next season, and is clearly doing some very unusual repertoire, Carl Fruhling, things like that. She's not entirely to be written off as a show pony, I think.
Richard, sorry, can I just butt in? If you don't want to written off as a show pony, don't say it's all about the encores, baby.
Why not? What's wrong with encores?
Nothing's wrong at all. But
what's wrong with light music? What's wrong with the smaller pieces? What's a world in a dewdrop?
But you just can't have it both. You're building her up as a show pony.
I don't think so. I think her qualities shine through in the repertoire that perhaps is not always judged most seriously, but I think probably should be taken as seriously.
I can get you a phone number.
Can I just say that at the very least, Richard has increased his chances of getting that exclusive Yuzhou Wang interview for The Spectator.
Well, I've interviewed Yuzhou Wang, and she was actually very delightful. So that aside, I was going to yank the gear a bit and say, what about Sviatoslav Richter, who nobody's mentioned? Slightly weightier. I didn't really hear him live, and
yes, I did mention him in the Bible and Shakespeare category early on. No, he's definitely the Bible, and he's definitely the Bible rather than Shakespeare. I heard him several times towards the end of his life, always playing austere repertoire. I heard him the Shostakovich Viola Sonata, than which you can get nothing more austere, and also frustratingly an entire program of Prokofiev miniatures, which was just long to hear him in his kind of thing. But it's been interesting listening also to some of his earlier recordings where he's just a firebrand and playing different pieces in a different way. It's very easy to forget what an incredible virtuoso he was. And I did a Building a Library for Radio 3 on the Chopin scherzos, which he won in inverted commas, which is just incredible for its lightness of touch and lightness of spirit, and actually connects in an interesting way to the kind of Lipati Pariah school of playing, which, if we're going to unpick that a bit, is based on a sort of lightness of texture, going away from a kind of thick, denser textured playing, if you like, if you want to try and be specific about it. I think what appeals to people about Pariah is that he can get this translucent sound, and that he's well, it's hard to escape the word lightness without making it sound a bit of a bit of a mixed blessing, but I'm kind of stuck there. I mean it in an entirely positive way because I think he's a wonderful pianist.
There were a few others that were mentioned when I asked on Facebook. Aymar, for example, Gerstein, John Ogden, there's a name that popped up every now and then. Louis Lotti, these sorts of names. I mean, there's so many. But also, if you're not going to do it, Ian, I'm going to do it. I'm going to mention the accompanists. And we have to mention people like Gerard Moore and more recently, obviously, people like Graham Johnson and Julius Drake and yourself. I mean, these are important people. I noticed a tweet from Susan Tomes, also a very fine pianist and accompanist, when she was watching the Young Musician of the Year, and she was rather put out that none of the accompanists had been named at all. It was all about the soloists. I mean, inevitably it's all about the young musicians, but none of their accompanists had been named, and quite right that she was put out by that. It can often be that way, can't it, Ian?
It can, and it often is. And if I may be so bold, by you calling them accompanists rather than pianists, you might be part of the problem there, Mr. Pearson.
I knew this was going to happen. As soon as I said it, I knew you were going to say it.
If you put the ball in front of an open goal...
I have to say here that ever since I've known Ian, which is actually quite a long time, I have never dared use the word accompanist, ever. And I've never put it in print. Man. And if Ian goes through... as I'm sure he can do in his spare time, all my reviews, he will not find the word accompanist.
Ditto here. I feel exactly the same. It's very loaded and contentious term. I mean, as a chamber musician, as a quartet player, I just don't like that idea that one player is less equal than another in that context. And as Ian has said, we're seeing more and more the idea of the virtuoso pianist who also is as serious about playing in ensemble music. It's a very, very welcome thing. I reviewed a gorgeous disc a couple of months ago of Simon Czeski, Greek violin sonatas, and there's no way you can claim that he's anything other than an equal partner and the creator of that sound world. And yet at the same time, as we know, a fantastically charismatic and skilled soloist.
Oh, he's a fabulous pianist. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The other group of pianists I want to bring in as we start to close out is the session pianists, because they are incredible because they can play anything and are often asked to play pretty much anything. Obviously, when you're playing lots of film scores, it could be almost any style. When you turn up in the morning, you won't have seen the music, almost certainly, before it's put in front of you. And it's a very particular skill. You don't spend years and years and years learning a piece of music to refine it. You've got 5 minutes probably before you have to start recording. So it is a very different skill. Three I wanted to mention in particular are Roderick Elms, Dave Hartley, and Andy Vinter, who are all sort of towering figures in that world. And they can play anything. And are required to do so at a moment's notice. So I think that this is a whole other world of piano playing, but they have to be phenomenally good musicians and be very, very versatile. So I think they deserve their place here. Ian?
And can I just add to this role of honour, ballet pianists, particularly at the Royal Ballet, and to my great shame, I've forgotten his name, he's a very nice man who retired a couple of years ago, who the Royal Ballet have in their repertoire ballets set to the Ravel Concerto, Tchaikovsky's Second Concerto, which is a huge piece, Rachmaninoff Paganini variations. And in the Tchaikovsky Second Concerto, not only does he have to play it live with orchestra, but during cadenzas where he's doing cascades of double octaves and God knows what, he's looking in a monitor where he can see the prima ballerina in question, and he has to coordinate some of these virtuoso gestures with her arabesque pirouettes, whatever they are, grand jeté, I don't know. But he has to do it in the right way that she doesn't land on her bottom. And the skill involved in that is just unbelievable because he's got so many other things going around him. And he's not choosing the tempi. The conductor has to choose tempi, which all the choreography is going to work. And he's got to make it plausible. I mean, hats off to him, I have to say. Incredible. And in rehearsal, he has to play the orchestra bits as well. He has to play his own concerto thing, but also simulate the orchestra so they can all work out what they're doing. Oh, my God. And that's up there with Nick Hodges, in my estimation.
Absolutely. We're gonna wrap up, but there are any others to throw in that we haven't mentioned? Has anyone mentioned Pellini, by the way? Pellini is another one that kept coming up in my little straw poll.
I felt we didn't really do justice to Mitsuko Uchida earlier. I think similar. We were talking about Brendel at the same time, and I think when a pianist sort of withdraws perhaps from the prominence they had at the peak of their career, perhaps this sort of reputational lag sets in. We sort of forget why they're so good. Perhaps we don't rate them highly enough, and maybe in, of course, 10, 20 years when they're we're further removed from their career, we'll perhaps look back and think, what a huge figure they were. And as Fiona mentioned, she's fantastic in all sorts of repertoire. I had her in Messiaen. But I always associate her with Mozart, of course. I think is the obvious thing to say. It's not a particularly original observation. But I just think it set me thinking of a whole list of pianists who do have, one does associate principally with Mozart, which is, music in which no pianist really makes a sort of virtuoso blockbuster reputation. But I was thinking of people like Annie Fisher. Also, Clifford Curzon is a name I kept coming back to, and there's wonderful recordings he made with Britain. And I was fascinated to read. I mean, he's apparently early in his career, he studied with Wanda Landowska, the harpsichordist, in the 1910s, 1920s, very early on, which presumably one can't help wondering if that shaped the sort of remarkably sort of graceful and clear way he had with Mozart.
Iain?
Annie Fisher is a heroine of mine. I think she was fantastic, very interesting character and wonderful, strong, interesting playing. You mentioned, we haven't mentioned Pellini, which is true. He's not a particular hero of mine, I have to say, but a big figure. Michelangelo hasn't come up, and Gilels hasn't come up. If we're talking Bible Shakespeare, he's absolutely up the Titanic playing. But we also haven't mentioned any of the fortepiano dudes. Robert Levin is very interesting, the work he does, very interesting in the whole improvisational side of things. Andreas Steyer is a very interesting musician. Christian Bezudenhout in more recent times. There's a lot of very interesting exploratory work. And Emil Yanchev, who's now conducting, started life as who's such an interesting musical personality, started life as the continuo for Corensis out in Perm, so that, and now he's picked up the baton. So there's so many interesting cross currents from different musical traditions going on there.
Absolutely. And finally, Fiona, any that we've missed out from you?
I had some who just interest me when they're going to play. I mean, I don't know they're playing extensively, but it's quite an interesting generation who happen to be American-based. Jeremy Denk, who, when he plays Bach, always gets right inside what he's doing, and he also plays very interesting programs and writes very interestingly. Jonathan Biss has also explored Beethoven very comprehensively. Other composers of that sort of generation, Alexander Melnikov, Kirill Gerstein, they're just players that make you think, I'd like to hear them. Someone I haven't heard of them, but who is always spoken of in hallowed terms is Maria Joao Pires.
Yes.
Whose name hasn't come up again.
Of course, yeah.
At that generation, that we're probably not hearing her as much now.
And another one of those unpredictable musicians. Iain?
Again, sticking with women pianists, going back to Russia, I'm a bit Russia obsessed, I have to confess. No one's mentioned Maria Yudina, who's very interesting, or Tatiana Nikolaeva, both parts of bigger Soviet stories. But there's also several amazing Russian pianists that we haven't discussed. Kissin, Pletnyov, the younger dudes, Gerstein and Boris Gilberg's very interesting, we haven't mentioned him. Dmitry Alexeyev, who teaches at the RCM, he is the most fantastic pianist who won the Leeds competition. I mean, there's just such a richness which has come out of that whole culture.
Yeah. Well, the last two that I wanted to mention were John Thompson and Fanny Waterman, because is there anyone of a certain age who doesn't have one of their collections on their shelves as as a piano student of any ability. I mean, the Fanny Waterman collections, I mean, Fanny, she's still around, still making a fuss, still out there, still doing the interviews at 100, whatever she is now, with her beloved Leeds piano competition. And John Thompson and others, of course, who do the books for the youngsters learning piano. You know, these are names that will never go away. And we could, as always with this, go on forever with so many wonderful pianists to talk about. But we must stop there, I think. And thank, as always, Fiona and Richard, and especially our special guest, Iain Burnside. Thank you so much, Iain, for joining us today. Real pleasure.
Thank you.
And we're very much looking forward to hearing everybody else's ideas on the top 5 pianists, as we've already demonstrated. There are many, many of them. And we'll look forward to reading those on Facebook and Twitter this week. And you can find us, as always, on Podbean, on YouTube, and on iTunes and Spotify. Until next week, goodbye.